Yo, what's going on, everyone? So one of the questions that I get asked all the time as a Brewmaster is, when I start playing Brewmaster and start working through keys, what's good to take with me when I'm trying to build up my own key? So one of the things I want to do today is go through what DPS and healers I think work really well with Brewmaster for Season 3 and Season 4 of Dragonflight. So we'll just go in order here, and we'll start off with DPS. So, as far as DPS go, looking at Death Knights aren't super strong this season or next season. They're not terrible, but they're not super duper strong. I would put Death Knights around the B and C tier here. I do think that Unholy is the better of the two specs between Unholy and Frost, so those aren't super bad. They're melee, they give you a kick. The extra grip is kind of nice to use as like an extra interrupt, and they do bring an extra defensive towards your group. But one of the problems, especially if you're starting with lower keys, is that they require the adds to live a little bit longer, kind of like Shadow. So they're not super great, they're not terrible, they're okay. So I would put them in the B and C tier here. Again, Unholy a little bit better than Frost in my mind. Moving over to the DHs. DHs work great with basically any comp. DH is super strong after their rework, so I would definitely put them in S tier, both in terms of damage, whether it's single target, AoE, that's pretty strong. They bring an AoE stun as well as a single target stun, and then they do have a kick, which is also like a ranged kick, which helps because it's like a 10-yard kick. So they're strong all around. Going over to the Druids next. Now this is something that some people will probably argue with me with, but when it comes to Druids, I have to put Boomkin in the D tier. Alright? One of the reasons for this is I just don't think they're super great for keys. A lot of times when you're working with a Boomkin, you need to like play around them, and they definitely play better if you're playing Vengeance or Prop Paladin. But where you're playing with a Brewmaster who has, we have Ring of Peace, we do have Leg Sweep, we've got a regular kick, and we've got Paralyze. Generally, we're looking for more stops. Okay, so Boomkin tends to play better with Vengeance and Prop Paladin, and not super great with Brewmaster. It does bring Verse, which is good. It does have that AoE silence. However, that AoE silence is going to get, one cast basically after the changes on it, and it's a minute cooldown. So I'm going to put them in the D tier. Feral, while Feral's not as strong, I would put Feral in the B tier. When you play with them, they're going to give you Verse. They've got Incap Roar. They do have a kick, right? They're going to bring that Verse buff, and they do have the short duration kick, which is able to work out okay with Brew. So I would put these in the B tier right after our Unholy DK for us there. Again, I know some of you might disagree with that. That's fine. Put it in the comments. Put all the hate in the comments for me. I don't know. Boomkins and me, we just don't jive when I'm playing Brew. I don't know. Alright, moving over to AUG and the different evokers. So for Augment, I'm going to put Augment in the A tier. A lot of people will probably put it in S. It's not bad. If you're only going to have one range and your other DPS are playing super strong, then AUG can be really, really good. But the fact that it does have a longer range on it, and it kind of depends on the rest of your group being good. A lot of times if you're working on building up a key, AUG isn't going to be as strong during like keys between 10 to 20 as it might be on keys that are above 20s. So that's why I'm going to put AUG in the A tier instead. For Devastation, I'm going to put Devastation in the B tier. I'm actually going to put it around here in between our two other members of the B tier. This has really strong DPS. I mean, it has similarities to Augment, and what it's bringing. It doesn't bring as much, extra healing or defensive capability as AUG, but it's pretty strong. It does have its uses with the AoE ability to get rid of enrages, especially for like Raging Week. So I'm gonna put Devastation in the B tier. Moving over to Hunters. Out of the Hunters, I think that Brew and BM plays really well together, especially because of the fact that BM gets buffed from Brew, and BM does a lot of damage with its current set bonus that it's going to have for Season 3 and Season 4. BM Hunters don't bring as much utility, obviously, as other melee or other classes, but the utility that they have is helpful. Being able to turtle things, they do have 2 other defensives on top of that, and then they do have pet stuns. They can go into scatter shot to, even though they've got, you know, the longer interrupt on 24 seconds, you can do something like a regular interrupt and then a scatter shot and then a regular interrupt, which, you know, kind of makes them pseudo have a melee interrupt. Obviously, if you're playing with other dot classes, that scatter shot will remove dots, which isn't as good. But BM is super strong, and I think it plays well with Brewmaster. If you're going to have a ranged, having a BM Hunter isn't bad at all. As far as survival, I think survival also plays well. Survival is not as good as BM this tier, and I don't think it's going to be as good as BM next tier either. So I'm going to put survival at the top of the B tier. It brings a shorter duration kick, but basically brings the same things that BM does, just with the, you know, different benefit of doing a little bit less damage. And then when it comes to Marks, Marks has just not been good at all this expansion. It's not going to be good next tier. It's not good this tier. So I'm going to put Marks at the bottom of the C tier. It has less utility than BM and Survival. It doesn't, because BM and Survival have that Intimidate, the single target stun. But instead, Marksman has Bursting Shot, which is the knockback instead, which they have to be like right on the mob to knock back. It's not like Typhoon where, you know, you can do it from a range. So that doesn't work out great. It does have really good burst AoE, but it's on a long enough duration that I still think that BM and Survival are going to be better. So I'm going to put Marks at the bottom of the C tier. Now, moving into the mages. For Arcane, I think that Arcane is probably the weakest of the 3 mage specs and doesn't bring as much as the others. So based on Fire and Frost just being so good, I'm going to put Arcane, you know, I could really put it at the top of the C tier. I could put it at the bottom of the B tier. I'll probably put it at the bottom of the B tier because I do think it does enough damage. It brings that lust. It brings enough things that it can be beneficial, especially with like the AoE shields that it can do for its barrier. So I'll put it at the bottom of the C tier. As far as Fire and Frost go, I'm going to put this at the top of the A tier. Now, you might be wondering, why would I put Fire and Frost in A instead of S when they're generally considered as S tier classes? The reason for this is, if you have one in your group and the rest are melee as a Brewmaster, I think it could probably go in the S tier. But if you're looking at building a comp around, you're going to notice I'm going to put a lot of the range that I think are really good in the A tier, because Brew works far better with melee than it's going to work with ranged. Okay, again, you can generally have one ranged and be okay in a group with a Brew, but that being said, if we're Vengeance or Prot Pally, absolutely S tier all day. But as far as any other tanks, whether it's Brewmaster, Guardian, Blood, Prot Warrior, you're going to want more melee with that. So that's why I'm going to put Fire and Frost in the A tier. They're going to do awesome damage. They do bring a lot of utility with Dragon's Breath. You've got the knockback that they have. You've got the Blazing Barriers. You've got Lust. You've got Intellect for your healer or any other casters. But again, I do think melee are going to play way better with us and the non-Vengeance, non-Prot Pally tanks. So that's why I'm going to put Fire and Frost in the A tier for Brewmaster specifically, for what you're looking for pugging to get your keys up. Again, if you want to take one of these, like, absolutely. Like, if you want to take one Frost, one Fire, one Aug, or one Brew, one from this category so far, I think that's great. But I'd highly recommend putting, melee in the rest. Alright, speaking of melee, we have our other monk compatriot. We've got the Windwalker. So, Windwalker brings basically the same thing as us. It's bringing Generous Pour, right? It might be giving us extra healing, or the reduced AoE damage. But as far as like what it brings, it's not bringing anything unique to our table. So, because of that, I think the other melee that we're going to see are going to bring more towards it. It's not bad to bring a Windwalker with us, but I'm going to put Windwalker in here with the Frost, DK, and the Marks Hunter because we're already playing Brew, I don't think having another Windwalker brings enough unique things with us. Again, you could probably put it at the bottom of the B tier, but I'm going to put it in C. I think that's where it deserves to be for this. Alright, going over to the Paladin. So, for the Ret Paladin, I'm going to put Ret Paladin up here along with our Havoc in the S tier. I'm going to put it actually above Havoc because it does bring some extra nice utility for us that Havoc doesn't. So, this is going to bring a single target stun on 40-second duration, right? It has strong AoE damage. It's got okay single target damage, but it's got above average survivability. It's also got that melee kick. It has blinding light on a 1.5-minute cooldown, and it has the ability to lay on hands other members of your group that might be struggling, especially if you're running with some weaker defensive players. Maybe use that on your BM Hunter. Maybe use it on something like an Enhanced Shaman, or, you know, maybe even a Holy Priest. So it's got utility there. It can also provide things that remove bleeds with Bop. It can also give us the reduced damage of Blessing of Sacrifice. So Ret is just super strong all around. So I think it's going to be another S tier for us when we're choosing what to bring. Generally, they're easy to play. They do a lot of damage. They bring you a lot of utility. Nothing more to say about it. They're just great all around. Moving over to the Priests. Shadow has become stronger this season in Season 3. It is going to have its stronger tier set from Season 2 for Season 4, which is going to make it really strong damage. However, it does come with the caveat of having a 45-second interrupt. Now, it does bring some other things like AoE Fear, which can be helpful. Mind Control might come into play somewhere. And it does do really well with both Afflicted with the spells, as well as the other one where you've got to CC mobs because it can Mind Control and give you a damage. It can also Shackle Undead. It's got some options there. So I think I'm going to put Shadow at the top of B. It's not going to be as strong for Brewmaster as Fire, Frost, or BM Hunter, but it's going to bring good damage. It does have the utility there, but it's a little lacking. Again, if you're going to bring a Shadow, make sure it's probably your only range that you bring, or just make sure that you've got another really strong melee that has a lot of utility with stops, if you're going to do two. So I'll put Shadow right there at the top of B. I probably put it in front of Survival. I think it's a better class than Survival, so we'll put it there. Moving over to the Rogues. Rogues are living good. So Assassination is probably the only rogue that's not living good. Assassination, honestly, like the utility and survival that the other rogue specs bring, it has. But what it doesn't have is the AoE damage to match that we want in Keys. Assassination is great in Raid, but it's just not good in Keys. So Assassination is going to join Boomkin down there at the D tier. However, Outlaw, aka Combat, Outlaw is probably the best, one of the best things that you can pair with a Brewmaster. It's got outrageous damage. It's got outrageous survival. It's got lots of utility when it comes to stops for single target mobs, being able to lock down mobs and help us out. It does bring an AoE Shroud, so you can do skips. It's just good all around. Sub is not as strong as Outlaw, but I'm also going to say that its survivability and other things that it brings, it's not as good DPS-wise. Let's put it at the top of the A tier. Let's put it there. Just to say just how much better the other three melee are. Let's put it there at A instead. Sub is easier to play. It doesn't have as good DPS, but it's still strong DPS, so I'm going to put it up there with A. Alright, moving over to the Shamans. So, Shaman, Elemental does bring a pretty decent kick for us. Because it's, unlike the other ranged, it has the melee duration kick. It is a 30-yard range, which is pretty nice. And it brings a lot of utility as far as, like, having the ability to knock back mobs on Sanguine Week, and it does bring the ability to, like, knock up mobs when it's not Sanguine Week as a stop. However, to knock mobs up like that, you kind of need to be in melee, and they're ranged. Poison Cleanse Totem is really awesome, especially for Afflicted Week, and it brings Lust. But Capacitor Totem having a 3-second charge on it is kind of doo-doo. So I'm going to put Elemental down here in front of Marks. It brings a little bit better utility than Marks. but it's just not as good for us, right? As far as like having a short interrupt, that's great, but that's pretty much all that it's going to bring for us. Yeah, so enough said about that. When it comes to Enhance, Enhance is the better of the two Shaman classes. I will put it above Unholy and below Survival. Its biggest thing that it is lacking is its survivability. Its only real defensive is Astral Shift on like a 1.5-minute cooldown, which is longer than like most other defensives that you're seeing as a melee. And then it does have the ability to bring up an Earth Ellie, which can be good for like moments that like, if something happens to you, or like I specifically use Earth Ellie when we're on Oakheart in Darkheart Thicket. There's like one set of ads that spawns right when you need to move out for the breath, and so like that's really good for that. But normally they're gonna have to use their Earth Ellie as a pseudo defensive to give extra health to themselves. And then their only other defensive is Ghost Wolfing, and you have to stay in Ghost Wolf for 4 seconds to get the full 20% DR. So its biggest thing that it's lacking is its survival. It does bring great utility. All the things that I said about Elemental, it brings, except for it's in melee, so it's able to knock mobs up. It's able to knock mobs away for the Sanguine. But really, the thing that's lacking here is its survivability. So that's why I'm going to put it in the B tier after Survival and Shadow. Going over to the Warlocks. Warlock, Affliction suffers from the same issue that the Assassination Rogue suffers from. It's just not super great in keys. It's designed more as like a PvP spec or a single target raid spec, and even like in raid right now, Affliction just hasn't really been great this expansion. So it's going to sit there at the bottom of our D tier at probably the worst choice for us. Now, Demo can be pretty strong. When it comes, it has really good damage. Its downsides are that it's got a long, just like Shadow, it's got the longer interrupt. It's not 24 seconds, it's a 30 second. But the biggest issue that it brings, I'll put it above mages here, in the B tier. The biggest issue is that when it interrupts, it stuns, right? Its interrupt is a stun from the Felguard. So, anytime that they interrupt, you're taking away the potential to use a stop because it's putting that mob on the stun DR. So that's kind of the issue with it. It does bring B-Res, it does bring Lock Rocks, it does bring the ability to skip things with a Lock Gate, which is great, but it loses a lot of the utility that Destruction and Affliction have in their other pets, right? You can't use the Felguard and be able to interrupt from anywhere while casting. You lose the ability to offensively dispel magic off of a target. You can't switch over to an imp to potentially dispel magic if that is needed for a boss encounter. So it's good, but it's probably not as good. I'll put it after the Devastation Evoker and above the Pharaoh, but it's just not as good as Destruction. Now that being said, Destruction has everything going for it that I just mentioned, including a B-Res. I think Destruction plays extremely well. I would actually probably put it, I'd probably put it in between Fire and Frost here on the A tier. The reason that Destruction gets even better on top of the things I just mentioned is that they have more frequent access to the improved Curse of Tongues. So one of the things I mentioned of one of the reasons you really want a lot of these melee specs with you when you're playing Brewmaster is you don't have the stops that a Vengeance DH or a Prot Pally brings, right? And their silences and their ability to lock down mobs and keep them from casting. So the ability to have a Destro Warlock put the Curse of Tongues that is like empowered, that makes it even slower casts on mobs, is just, it makes it every interrupt that you have even better, right? You're having to interrupt a lot less. It brings all that utility. It brings the gateway. It brings the res. It brings the Healthstones. It brings all those interrupts and the dispels. So I would say it's super strong. It doesn't bring defensive utility towards your group, you know, because when you're going to higher keys, that Healthstone isn't going to protect you, right, from a one-shot. But as far as like looking for what to pug, you know, anywhere from the 10 to 20 range, it's going to be great. Anything above 20, it's going to be really good too. And they have super strong survival. So I'll put it in between Fire and Frost. I do think Fire is a little bit better than Frost, so we'll put it there. Alright, moving over to our Warriors. As far as Arms and Fury go, they bring a lot of utility. They have the ability to have a regular melee interrupt. They bring Rally, so that you have kind of a pseudo-defensive, right? It increases your health. It's similar to a damage reduction, but not the same, right? Because it increases your health pool, so it can help with those one-shots. They have super high survivability, both Fury and Arms. The thing that Arms brings that Fury doesn't is that it's uncapped in AoE, but its AoE just isn't as strong. So I'm going to put Arms here at the bottom of the A list, and I'm going to put Fury up here. I'll probably put it above Havoc. I think it plays really well. It's getting buffed by us as being a physical damage dealer. It has the ability to bring a 5-target Fear. So it's an AoE Fear, but it only hits 5 targets, so it's not as good as like the Priest one. They can spec into Shockwave for it's like a 40-second AoE stun in front of them, which is super strong. It brings Spell Reflect, which is really great at certain bosses to reflect damage that's targeted them. Yasma at the end of Atal Dazar, anytime that they get targeted with Racking Pain, they can reflect that. When we are looking at Nightmare Bolt on the final boss of Darkheart Thicket, they can reflect that. When it comes to... There's just a lot of abilities like Reflect. Any mob that casts at them, they can just call out or have a macro that says, like, I'm spell reflecting, and boom, it just does damage, right? It's just free damage. And that means that they don't need to use Interrupt. So they're really strong. They play really well. They are capped at 5 targets, but their priority damage in that is super strong. So as long as they're on, like, the priority damage, when we're doing AoE packs, they work really well. And their single target is up there along with, like, it's not as good as like a BM Hunter single target, but it's really strong. I think their utility and survivability is very good. So this is how I would put all of our damage dealers when we're looking at what to bring to keys, okay? So in our S tier, we've got the 4 melee that I think are the strongest. A tier has a lot of those super strong casters and ranged, right? As well as the 2 not as good specs with our melee. And then a lot of our other good range DPS are going to go into the B tier there that maybe aren't as good utility-wise with Brewmaster, along with some of those other melee that just don't have the survivability or as good damage. And then when we get down to the C and D tier there, it's just specs that I would try to avoid. I'll probably, again, Frost and Windwalker, potentially you could make the argument for putting them in the B tier. If you're going to pick one, they're probably okay-ish, but I would definitely avoid Boomkins. Don't ever take an Assassin Rogue. Don't ever take an Affliction Warlock. They're just, yeah. That's my opinion on that. So that is what to look for when you are trying to like pug your own key and kind of build your groups around for DPS, for Brewmaster specifically. Now, let's go ahead and switch over to healers, because healer is the other part of that equation, and sometimes a stronger healer class can allow you to bring some of these other specs from like the A or the B tier, or maybe like 2 of them together. So let's take a look at this. So when it comes to healers, our first healer choice here comes from the Resto Druid. Resto Druid is just all around probably the best healer that you can have when we're looking at healers in general right now. I think this season and next season, Resto Druid is super strong. It also works extremely well with Brewmaster. It counters our stagger really well with all of its hots, so that generally they can just keep a rejuve on us, maybe a life bloom, and pretty much never need to heal us. Our healing that we get through our tier set and our passive healing is just pretty much good enough that they don't really have to worry about us. On top of that, they bring us a verse buff for the entire group. If they spec into it and are good at cat weaving, then they do have the ability to have a melee interrupt. Though a lot of times, especially in lower keys, you're probably going to find Resto Druids that are maybe dealing damage through like just using like Sunfire and stuff, so they might not be the interrupt there. But they're good healers, good for group healing, good for that. They do bring a defensive on a 1-minute cooldown in Ironbark, so that you can have that available for people, for you or for members of your group. And then they do bring some AoE healing cooldowns that can be helpful too. They bring utility in the form of knockback. They also have mass roots, and they do have the in-cap roar, which is great. They're the best that we can find. Now, going forward to the Evoker, I think that Evoker is hands down the worst healer that we could have as a Brewmaster. I'm not going to put it in the D tier because I don't think it's like avoid them at all costs. They do bring some things that are helpful. AoE soothes. They do bring Lust. They do have some utility when it comes to knockups, but their healing just feels lackluster, right? They have to be facing directionally, basically, to heal. A lot of times things are spread out. If you get a full melee group, it might not be as bad, but their healing just doesn't really drive that well. And having the movement ability just isn't as strong as a buff for us. So I think the Evoker is going to be the biggest thing that you probably want to avoid when it comes to healing for the Brewmaster. Now, moving over to Monk. Even though Mistweaver brings a lot of the same things that we do as a Brewmaster, I would put them for strength up in the A tier. They do bring another leg sweep. They bring another melee interrupt. Cocoon is super strong. They can help us cover some of those buffs for the rest of our group by giving either the reduced AoE damage by 4% or the increased healing by 8%. Generally, they take those, so that helps. They have really strong healing in general that works with either AoE damage or burst damage. So I think that their healing feels good. And even though they're bringing a lot of the same things that we are, that utility is super helpful. So I'm going to put it up there with the Resto Druid. Not as good, but second in line. Now, moving forward to the Holy Paladin. Holy Paladin isn't as strong this season. I'll be honest, for Season 4, I'm not super sure how strong they're going to be, which one of their set bonuses is going to come into play. I know that the nerf to their mana regeneration really hurt them. But that being said, the ability and utility that they bring is pretty strong when it comes to the utility that we need, not being a Vengeance or a Prop Paladin. So I'm going to put them up in B. Their healing isn't maybe as good as the Mistweaver or the Resto Druid, but they do bring the ability to bring Devo Aura or Ret Aura. They do have the group-wide defensive, right, and Devo Aura for when, you know, the mass ability for it. They do bring the melee interrupt, the single target stun. They bring Sack, which is good defensively. They also bring Lay on Hands, Bop to clear bleeds, or just to give an immunity to someone. So I think that they play well. They're not as good as some of the other healers, but I would put them in the B tier there. Okay, going up next, we are at the Priests. I'm going to say something pretty controversial here, and some of you might disagree with me. But when it comes to Disc, I feel that Disc can be super strong. If you have someone who knows what they're doing when they're playing Disc, Disc is easily A tier. It doesn't bring the utility as much when it comes to like interrupts and stuff. It doesn't have that. It is lacking in that ability. But it does bring the single target defensive for someone, and it does bring barrier. It can do mind soothes for certain skips. However, the problem is that most people who are trying to play Disc are trying to play it because it's good and not because they're good at it. And so I will say that most of the time whenever I'm dealing with a Disc Priest, it's normally that they're a Holy Priest main and they're trying to get better at Disc. And so generally their healing just isn't as strong. They don't know what they're doing with it. And so when we're looking to build a group, especially if you're working on, you know, just getting weekly keys done, a 20, or maybe you're working on building your key up to a 20, right? I'm going to say that Disc probably isn't as strong. I would put it below the Holy Paladin in the B tier because there's just too many people out there who are truly Holy Priests, but they're trying to play Disc, and when they play Disc, even though it brings those other things that are good, they just don't play it as well, and they'd be better off just playing Holy. So, Disc, I'm going to put it at the bottom of the B tier here. Again, feel free to tell me how wrong I am in the comments, but that's been my experience. I'm going to stick with it. It's kind of like the Boomkin of the DPS, right? A lot of people will probably disagree, but my experience has just been some of them really just don't understand how to play Disc. So that's where we're going to put it. Now, Holy Priest, while not as strong defensively, does work really well with Brew as far as his heals go. Every single one of their heals, because their mastery does put a hot on us whenever they do target us with a heal. So it can be pretty strong. Where they are lacking is in the utility, right? They don't bring an interrupt. All they have is Psychic Stream, or like Shackle Undead if it's an undead that they could use. So they're not as good as some of the other classes. So you could probably, I say, especially after the last change that they just did to Holy Priest at the very end of Season 3, their damage is super strong, which can help you make up things and kind of maybe pass some checks there. So I'll put them above Holy Paladin. I do think they're a stronger healer than the Holy Paladin as far as like working with the group in this, but they bring less utility. So you could really, I think I probably could go either way. I think the fact that Paladin is lacking in the mana right now is probably what puts Holy Priest above Holy Paladin, but the fact that they don't have as good utility as the other specs is why I'm going to put them in B instead of like S or A. And then lastly, we have the Resto Shaman. So Resto Shaman is one that brings a lot of utility, just like we mentioned with Enhance and Elemental. It has the knockback for Sanguine Week, or the knock up for non-Sanguine Weeks that can be used as an AoE stop. However, again, that does require them to be in melee. Now, they're kind of like Evokers in the fact that they generally try to play a little bit closer because a lot of their healing is better within 25 yards, especially with like chain heal of other targets and Ancestral Guidance that they use that. So there's that. It does bring Spirit Link Totem and Healing Tide Totem, which can be helpful. The ability to have Poison Cleanse Totem is pretty strong, especially on Afflicted weeks, and there's a lot of like different dungeons where having multiple Poison Cleanses, especially like Everbloom this season and Darkheart Thicket, can be super strong. So I'm going to put them, especially with their melee interrupts, I'll probably put them above the Holy Paladin. Again, this is one where you could probably change the order. They're not super duper strong. If they play in melee, they're a lot better than they would be if they're playing in ranged. So I'll put them in here. Again, you could kind of move around these first three in here how you'd like. We'll probably put Holy Priest, Resto Shaman, and then Holy Paladin. They do bring Lust, right, which can be super helpful, especially if you're dealing with a lot of those melee from the S tier that I put in the last thing that don't bring a Lust. And they help by, again, giving you another interrupt and another AoE knock-up ability. So that's how I would group up our healers. Resto Druid, definitely the best. Then Mistweaver Monk. Then I'll stick with Holy Priest, Resto Shaman, Paladin, and then Disc. Again, Disc, if you look out and find someone who knows what they're doing, they could easily be A tier up here. But again, I'll say for weekly keys and building up a key as you're starting to work on Brewmaster, I would put those towards ones that maybe aren't as good for you. And then again, Presence Evoker is probably the only one that I would say, both because of how they play right now, how good they are in general, and how they play together with Brew, is probably the one that you could avoid. Some of you might be thinking, well, you know, Kyle, I don't agree with this. Like, I think some of these work a lot better than others. Keep in mind, this is specifically for playing as a Brewmaster, right? These things, especially a lot of the DPS here, are going to be vastly different if you're playing as a Vengeance Demon Hunter or a Prot Paladin. But if you're playing as a Brewmaster, Guardian Druid, Blood DK, or a Prot Warrior, I think these are the things that you're going to want to look for. So, if you have anything to say, put it down in the comments. I'd love to hear your discussions, and maybe you might be able to change my mind on a couple things. If you like the video, please make sure to like, and if you want to subscribe to get easier access to my content, have it show up in your feed more often, you can do that. It also helps me out. But otherwise, I will see you in the next video.